Hi, I'm Patrick Johnson from the Madison Review, and I'm sitting here with Maurice today on this Thursday. So the Madison Review is fully staffed by undergraduates. How does working with students influence your work?
It's easy for me to remember when I was a student and how much the world of learning, and particularly the world of literature, opened all of my thought and allowed me to make connections between thought and experience and find my own terms to express that connection. And I feel that one of my missions as a teacher is to create conditions for my students to have a similar kind of experience and make similar connections and find their own original ways to express those connections between thought and life, their own experience. It's always inspiring to me to see a student who crosses a threshold in his or her writing or understanding that makes the originality of their expression obvious. So I love teaching.
Yeah.
Seems a pleasant group.
Is reading in the Midwest or other parts of America different from reading in the South at all?
Let me back up just a little bit. I would say sometimes giving a poetry reading is odd because some people come to a poetry reading perhaps out of some curiosity and don't really know what they're getting into, and kind of see the whole thing as something they're uncertain about or unfamiliar with, and that can be, it becomes sort of a lukewarm experience. But there are times when whatever I have to say as a poet makes a connection to someone. And my best experience is reading before people come when someone who is not a poet, but perhaps someone who has secretly loved poetry for a long time, and a person comes up afterwards and says, I like that one poem you read about such and such. And when I have a connection like that with someone who is not an official poet, him or herself, I generally appreciate that the most. And often in the South, when I'm reading around Kentucky or Tennessee or Virginia, places like that, upper South, because of the nature of some of the things I write about, a rural southern world, I tend to have more connections with some of the people who come to those things. I've given readings in New York City, and that's a different experience.
Occasionally you read in traditional meter and form.
Mhm.
What interests you about doing that sort of work?
Because I believe that poetry itself is a tradition. I think I don't want to be overly firm about form and meter, particularly with my students, but I believe thinking of the poem as a composition that requires order and structure in order to be held together and sort of held up. I'm always fascinated by that, and always think about form and structure first before I even consider whatever it is I'm trying to say or think through in a poem. And that gets into, on the level of language, it gets into things that seem simple yet are often the sources of the greatest labor of writing, things like grammar and syntax. That sounds terribly old-fashioned today to be concerned with those things, but I've done this long enough that I realize at least I need to be thinking about grammar and syntax and weighing the sense or meaning of the expression with a kind of counterbalance of rhythm and sound, which is sort of what we call the line of poetry. And I believe a lot of poets I know spend their early years implicitly trying to find the line that is the right vehicle for their rhythm of thought and rhythm of feeling, rhythm of observation. It is, the line measures many things, but I think a poem is thought and feeling and meaning in time. And so to capture its in-time quality, things like meter become more important. And you can quicken or slow that sense of time through lots of different devices. But I think a poem that satisfies me as a reader or in writing one is one that gives me the sense of the expression in time, in the passage of time.
Definitely. When starting a poem, how much of the narrative, if there is one, is known to you before you start writing?
Probably very little of it. there may, be an unconscious level where I have a kind of story in the back of my mind that I want to get to. But hardly ever, even if I have just a tiny little narrative in my head, it's very rare that the poem actually stays on track with that.
Right. Are the landscapes you write about specific places, places from memory, imaginary places, or something else?
I would say all of the above. I have a landscape in my mind that is perhaps an idealized idea of a Kentucky landscape. I don't have any other landscape that impresses itself on me the way my own experience of a Kentucky landscape does. And that's simply the result of growing up in Kentucky and knowing that my family's been in Kentucky since the late 1700s, and there is a long-standing familial tie to a particular place. And I very much believe that the variation of a landscape, the hills, the deep hollows and things like that, affect one's thought. And there is, I believe, a kind of parallel between what we see with our eyes and what we traverse as we walk, and the shape of our thoughts and the contour of our mind. And I'm always tuned into that. And that's more than anything the primary subject of what I'm trying to write about.
You talked a little bit about Kentucky and rural spaces, and I don't know if you've ever lived on a farm, but to what extent
are on one right now.
To what extent are animals important to your poetry?
They're absolutely important. I don't raise any livestock. We just have vegetables and fruit and bees. But all around me are horses and cattle and sheep and goats and chickens and then I'd say wild animals have a greater spiritual significance for me, and we've got plenty of them.
Great. Well, thanks a lot for sitting down.
Sure.
I'll tell you something funny. We were considering having this outside by the lake, so I guess be glad that didn't happen. But Maurice Manning, thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you.